You're watching Inside Utah Politics.
Time now for our panel to debate Proposition 2, the medical cannabis ballot initiative. This week we have State Representative Brad Daw and Connor Boyack with Libertas Institute. Great to have both of you with us. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
This has been a very heated debate, to say the least. So let's just throw a few ideas out there. I'm going to give both of you an opportunity to go back and forth here. Obviously, the latest development, the LDS Church once again releasing or weighing in publicly through a memo through its attorneys. Connor, basically a rebuttal to a rebuttal that you guys put out. Start with you. What do you make of that memo, and what are the top points you want people to know about?
The top points, I think, are that it's largely irrelevant in terms of persuading the public. Nuanced rebuttals to rebuttals of legal memos aren't that persuasive. As you look at the polling, very few people are undecided about this. We've been having this conversation publicly for several years. Most people's minds are made up. And while we take objection with many of the things that are in this latest memo, we think that things are mischaracterized and misleading. The Curtin McConkie new memo claims that we agree with their original memo when in fact we don't. At this point, we think the public's just ready to vote, and we're just going to move forward. We think their latest memo is largely unpersuasive, and nobody in the public is really going to change their mind as a result of it.
Okay, we'll get back into some specifics, but Representative Daw, let's bring you in. Does the memo make some good points, and if so, what are they?
Well, actually, I think it does make some good points. There are some glaring errors in the initial rebuttal. The one that sticks out the most is the homegrown portion of it. Obviously, you can grow it in your own home if you're in an area that's not zoned exclusively residential, which a lot of rural areas, that's going to be most houses. And there's other parts of it where, again, Libertas does kind of agree with it, but then say it's not a big deal. And that's what Curtin McConkie points out as well. Actually, it is a big deal, and here's why.
Respond to that. The homegrown, because that, if you look at the memo, that's really the biggest argument it's making, is the homegrown element of it.
We've told legislative leadership, we've told everyone in the public, our intent has never been that people can actually grow their medicine. The only way that that provision realistically triggers is if the government, as has happened in other states, drags its feet and does not license dispensaries. There have been states where the public weighs in, they say, we don't want patients to be criminals. Years go by and people still don't have their medicine. We didn't want that for Utah. We wanted a bit of a pressure point to say, look, government, if you don't follow the will of the public and enact the program, get the dispensaries up and running, we want something to be a counterpoint and some pressure. So the intent is to never grow. It's not, you know, this crazy idea of home grow as it's been perceived. When you look at the original memo and they call it the Marijuana Initiative rather than the Utah Medical Cannabis Act, when they claim in the latest memo that, oh, this appears to be a libertarian desire for recreational marijuana, it's clear that the LDS Church's legal memos are weighing into political attacks rather than a fair and balanced legal analysis.
Let's get more into that in a second, but first, bring you back in, Representative Daw. Do you see this as an avenue to legalize recreational marijuana in the state of Utah?
Well, clearly and undeniably it is. I mean, the fact is the time frame that the initiative has in it is fairly tight, but more than that, this notion that somebody can grow their own medicine at home is pretty glaringly odd to me. For example, if what somebody needs is a CBD or some particular ratio of CBD to THC, that would be almost impossible for them to have the technique and ability to grow at home. The only reason that I can see for somebody to grow their own at home is so they can grow it, cure it, and smoke it.
Connor, respond to that, because people, you know, the libertarian way, as you brought up, is to, you know, legalize and get government out of the way. Address that once and for all. Are you looking at a recreational avenue through this ballot initiative?
So we said earlier on, Doug Fabrizio earlier this week, we've said to legislative leadership and every reporter who's asked, Libertas Institute has no plans to ever push for recreational marijuana. That's not the intent with this Medical Cannabis Act. We know how poorly it polls. We think it's a dumb idea to lock people in cages because they use a drug in their basement. We don't want people using drugs. It should be treated as a public health issue and not a criminal justice issue. But that's a conversation for another day that Utah may never be prepared to have. At this point, we want patients to not be treated as criminals. Our opponents continue to cite Colorado and home grow as these scary things to try and induce fear so that people don't support this ballot initiative. We think most voters are going to see through the transparent fear-mongering and support the proposition.
Any thoughts on that before we move on to the next topic?
Well, the fact is you can call it fear-mongering, you can call it whatever you want. It is simply factually describing the initiative. Now, as far as recreational goes, every single state where they have passed by initiative a medical program. They've turned right around the next day and begun the process and the program of going to recreational. We've seen that happen time and time again. And this particular initiative is so wide open, it's difficult to imagine that it's not going to ultimately lead to recreational. Maybe not next year, but that's where it's going to go if the initiative stands as is.
Before we move on.
It's simply not true. Look, none of the proponents on Proposition 2 plan on day one afterward to push for recreational. We've publicly committed that we're never doing that. It's not the intent of anyone who's involved. And there are over 24 medical-only states that have stayed there. This notion that it's a slippery slope is simply not true. And frankly, Utah's culture is far different than California or Colorado. Utahns don't want this. It doesn't poll well. We're not pushing it. So unless someone else out there is going to come out of the woodwork, it's not happening.
Let's get on to this idea of a special session before the election to try to come up with a compromise bill. Do you like that idea?
I think it's unlikely, and I don't think there is much chance of it. So I don't see it happening. Whether I like it or not, it doesn't seem like it's very likely to happen.
Okay, and you guys would be just fine with that?
Well, I'm told by people in legislative leadership that Representative Daw is among the folks who've been trying to push this idea and get this done. Not only do we think it's a bad idea, it's simply not going to happen. The governor himself has repeatedly said publicly that there's no point in having a discussion until there is a bill, there's details, there's consensus. We have none of that right now, and so it's just a bad idea.
Have you been pushing for it?
Absolutely not. I have not been pushing it. That is absolutely dishonest. I haven't talked to anybody. People have talked to me about a special session, and I've said, well, do what you can, but I have not called anybody or pushed anybody for a special session prior to the election.
Pass or fail, the governor says we need to come together and find a solution. If this fails, or even if it passes, what are some modifications both of you guys could get behind? A compromise bill, what might that look like? Connor.
So Libertas Institute got this ball rolling 5 years ago. We've been at the forefront of the medical cannabis reform issue the entire time in Utah. We've been open to conversations from all parties about details. What do we actually want to get done? We're open to whatever people have specific ideas. What we're seeing, though, from our opposition is either high-level, vague concepts that don't really help us get anywhere, or fear-mongering statistics. There's a low-trust environment right now where the public is worried that the legislature has had numerous opportunities. They've dragged their feet and only done minimal reform. So we're okay with compromise as long as it's substantive. That's what the public is ready for.
Okay. What would you be willing to give on to come up to a bill that everyone can get behind?
Let me give you some specific proposals that we have. First of all, the idea that the legislature has dragged its feet is really utterly false. You can look at a number of bills that have been passed, and the fact is that this time next year there will be operating dispensaries, whether the initiative passes or not. There will be medical cannabis available. Now, admittedly, right now, it is for a very limited set of patients. So the one thing we need to do, obviously, is expand that list to something similar to what's in the initiative. The way we see it going specifically is we want to have doctors be able to prescribe specific dosages, a specific regimen, and a specific product. And we want it dispensed not by a completely untrained bud tender, but by a pharmacist.
Okay. We only have like 15 seconds left, but would you guys be willing to give up on full plant and growing at home?
Our intent has never been growing at home, so if we find some other pressure point to make sure the government actually implements the law, that's totally fine. And full plant, this idea of full spectrum or CBD and THC, the thing to recognize here is that patients need different options, and if the legislature doesn't give it to them, they're still going to use it. They're going to be criminals. That's wrong. We need to give them everything that they need.
Have to end it right there. This conversation could go on a lot longer, but I appreciate both of your time. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Stay with us. We'll be right back with more Inside Utah Politics right after the break.